Right, it looks like we're live. So, Chris, thanks for coming on. I really appreciate you taking the time to have this conversation with me. Just to jump right in, or actually, why don't you start by telling us a little bit about yourself?
Oh, okay. Well, I'm kind of bivocational. I work with a Christian organization called Crew. It's a campus ministry on college campuses all over the place. I also teach philosophy in various settings here in Columbia, Missouri, where I live. I'm married. I have 4 kids, 2 of whom have just started college, so it's pretty exciting for me. I love soccer. I don't know. I really enjoy gummy bears. It's my favorite snack. I don't know. What else do you want to know?
That's pretty good. So, you're a theist. You believe that there is a God.
Yes, that's an important point.
Yeah, and so my position, I am an atheist, so I don't believe that there are any reasons, evidence, or argument that indicate the existence of God. And the reason I believe this is because the omni properties that God has, all powerful, all knowing, all loving, eternal, necessary, divine aseity, pure actuality, perfect simplicity, all of those different properties, they're all like arbitrary de facto infinite. So when you add them to an explanation, it gains infinite explanatory power and scope and can explain anything, just literally anything. And so they can be used to solve just any potential problems at all. Like I like to say, a bridge of infinite length can span any chasm. The only advantage theism has over the naturalistic sciences is that it has these omni properties. And science doesn't use them explicitly for the reason that they just give infinite explanatory scope and power to anything you apply them to. And so, but naturalists can add these properties to naturalist theories if they wanted to. They could just say the multiverse is all powerful, the multiverse is eternal, or general relativity is outside of space and time, or whatever. And so you can add these properties to the naturalistic theories just like you can to a supernatural theory to get to answer the same questions, to give equivalent explanatory scope to any theory on the supernatural or naturalistic side. And so any and all the arguments that are used to indicate theism only indicate theism because they have these omni properties, and science can't answer them because science is restricted from using these omni properties and these things that are outside of the scope of what we can demonstrate. And so because we can add them to anything, we can show that any of the alternatives to theism can also answer all of the arguments theism does. So there's like the flying spaghetti monster could potentially answer all of the arguments theism does, or deism, or polytheism, pantheism, or my favorite, naturalistic pantheism, or all the different alternatives. Because you can add these omni properties to any of them, they all have exactly the same explanatory power and scope. And so from my perspective, because when we add these omni properties, they make all of the different alternatives essentially equivalent. You can't, one isn't better than the other. There's no way to indicate one over the alternatives. And that's evidence is something that makes one possibility more likely to be true. But if that same possibility works equally for all the different alternatives, well, then it's not really evidence for one over the others. And so, so the question I have for you is, what evidence do you believe there is for theism that indicates theism over all these alternatives that, like, for example, I can't just use the same argument to indicate pantheism as opposed to these alternatives, or as opposed to theism?
Okay, so what evidence can I give for theism that does not also work for other worldviews?
Right.
Right, okay. Okay. Well, that's a good question. I suppose that's a good place to start. So there are certainly arguments. I'm guessing, would you count just philosophical arguments as evidence?
Possibly, if they can indicate one alternative over the others, then yes. But if they can't, then no.
Well, I just meant in principle, not just for God, but
yes, in principle.
Okay. So, people talk about the cosmological argument, right, which you're familiar with, which doesn't, it certainly doesn't prefer Christianity per se over, say, Islam or perhaps other religions. But do you not think that the cosmological argument would be evidence in a way that would raise the probability of theism, but not raise the probability of naturalism? Do you think it raises the probability of both equally?
Yes, I do, because the cosmological argument just states that the universe began to exist, or everything that begins to exist has a cause. The universe began to exist, therefore the universe has a cause. And
Right.
that cause, it doesn't expand on what that cause is. That cause could be a god, but it could also be an undiscovered natural property that we just don't know about yet. So there's no reason to think that from that argument, it does not in any way raise the probability of a god there.
Okay. Or rather, it doesn't raise the probability of a God any more than for some other entity.
Or any more than just a naturalistic explanation.
Okay, so it does raise the probability for a God, but since it also, in your view, raises the probability of other hypotheses, then it's no advantage for the theist.
Right. It does not raise it more than naturalism. They're still on equivalent terms. There still has to be a cause, so it's still a valid argument. It just doesn't indicate a god.
Okay. So in your view, I'm just trying to think about how would I think of if a piece of, so suppose we're doing a murder investigation and we have multiple suspects, and let's say we find a long black hair on the murder victim, and two of our suspects have long black hair, right? How would you describe that situation in terms of evidence?
Underdetermined.
Well, I mean, is the long black hair evidence?
Could be.
Well, maybe it's not obvious whether it is or not. I'm just wondering what you would, do you think, it seems like there's two ways you could go based on what you're just saying. Like either it's evidence for both of those suspects and not for the other suspects, or it's not evidence at all because it supports more than one hypothesis.
Oh, right. It could go either way. So it could be underdetermined. Like, for example, if you had a box and you said there was a rabbit in the box, and your evidence for this is that the box weighs 2 pounds.
Right.
I mean, that's not evidence of a rabbit because it could be evidence of a lizard or a coffee mug or a 2-pound weights or etc. It's underdetermined evidence. So it's evidence of something which can be explained by a rabbit.
Okay.
But you can consider that evidence in some direction, as opposed to like the principle of explosion from falsehood anything follows. A square circle exists, therefore rabbit, therefore it's a rabbit. I mean, it's just a false argument, and false arguments don't work for anything. They're evidence of absolutely nothing. But in my case, since I'm just making the argument that there's no evidence of a god as opposed to naturalism, I'm just saying there's no way to indicate one over the other. And so either way, it doesn't really make a difference for my argument.
Okay, so all right, so yeah, I think you defined evidence, and I don't know if this is like a hard and fast definition or you just kind of threw that out, but you said evidence is something that raises the probability of one hypothesis over another, or you didn't just say it raises the probability of X, but it has to raise it above or make something more likely than some other alternative. Is that right, or how did you put it?
Yeah, that's good enough.
Okay, because you could think evidence is just anything that, like evidence is E evidence for H, or H is your hypothesis that you like. Is E evidence for H? Well, does E raise the probability that H is true? Full stop, right? Not relative to other hypotheses, but does it just raise the probability of H? Then it would count as evidence for H, right? Now, it might also count just as well evidence for H1, I mean, H2, H3, H4, but it would be evidence for all of them, wouldn't it?
Right.
Or
right. That's totally fine to explain that. But if there's infinitely many H's, then that's still 0 probability.
Wait, if there's infinite many what?
H's. If it supports H1, H2, H3, H4 ad infinitum, that's still exactly 0% for H1.
Well, I don't even know if this is an important point, but you kind of caught my interest here. So like the rabbit in the box thing, right? So let's suppose the first thing that happens is you tell me, okay, we've got a box. What do you think is in the box? And I say, I don't know, maybe a rabbit, right? So I have nothing to go on yet at all. So that's a completely, other than the fact that the box is a certain size. So I know it's not an elephant. I know you're probably not being mean and saying, oh, there's hydrogen molecules in there or something. But if you said, well, the box weighs 2 pounds, now that would raise the probability that it's a rabbit. It would, of course, raise the probability for lots of other things. I don't know if an infinite number of things, but that would tend to be confirming evidence or confirming information for it's a rabbit, as opposed to, because a rabbit, I don't know how much rabbits weigh. They weigh about 2 pounds.
I would guess some of them do, some fat ones.
Oh, is that a lot for a rabbit? So I don't know. I mean, I'm just wondering, maybe we can bypass this and move on to something else. But because something could be evidence for something, but just not really be decisive evidence, or it could equally support several other hypotheses, which would make it not very helpful, but it would still count as evidence, right? I mean, the box weighs 2 pounds would not tend to increase the probability that there is a bowling ball in the box. Bowling balls weigh a lot more than that. I can't remember how much. I don't know. What are they? 5 pounds? I don't know.
I think they go from 5 to 20.
There, you see? Okay. So unless it's like a really strange bowling ball. Anyway, I like to think about evidence and what evidence is and how it works. So
yeah, I'm happy to grant that can definitely be an interpretation of evidence. But my main claim is that there's no reason to believe there is a God as opposed to just naturalism. So whether or not you want to count that as evidence or not, it isn't evidence of a God as opposed to naturalism.
Okay, so going back to the cosmological argument, the conclusion is that the universe has a cause, right? That's all you've got. That's pretty generic. Now you're saying that conclusion, that the universe has a cause of its existence, would support a naturalistic view just as much as it would support a theistic view.
Right. I would probably actually lean more towards the naturalistic view, but yes, my argument is that they are equal.
So I'm just curious why you think that. Why does that seem perfectly at home in a naturalistic universe to you?
Why wouldn't it? Could you expand a little bit more?
Well, so when we talk about, this is why why Christians like the cosmological argument, because they think it actually does give you reason to prefer a theistic hypothesis. So one of the problems that this argument is sort of playing on is, if the universe, that's all of space and time, right, came into existence at some moment, right? And before that, right, because there wouldn't be any time, so using before is kind of a weird thing to do. But apart from the universe, there was nothing. There was no space, time, there was no matter, there was not even, I don't know how there could be laws prior to the existence of everything material, everything physical. So now it doesn't seem odd. Now it's going to seem odd to atheists, I guess, because God probably seems odd to you. But as a hypothesis, to posit a being not composed of matter, right? So it wouldn't have the problem of having to, somehow the universe having to create itself, or the universe pre-existing its own existence, or some bizarre thing like that. So you have a being who existed apart from the universe, is not material, is not composed of matter, and this being having other certain properties that would make it a very good candidate for the ability to create a universe. That seems to make more sense to me than saying, well, the universe just caused itself, or what is I don't quite see what the cause would be, or what it would be like. Like, what would that cause be like if we don't have God as a hypothesis? We cut out the God hypothesis, say, well, it's got to be something else. What would that something else be?
Right. So from my perspective, this is a misinterpretation that most theists have of physics. They're not understanding what the physics actually means. So when physics says space and time had a beginning, they mean the space and time as represented in the equations of general and special relativity. They do not mean all kinds of space and all possible kinds of time. That's completely false. There are different kinds of possible kinds of space and time. There are things that could definitely exist that are natural before and outside of our space and our time. The only thing that began to exist at the Big Bang is our space and our time, full stop. So there's no contradiction with naturalism saying there was something before the Big Bang at all. There's theories of like Einstein's imaginary time, Itzelbar's two-time physics, Nima Karni-Hamad's emergent space-time, is amplitude-hedron. Sean Carroll's working on emergent space-time. Like there's nothing in the Big Bang that indicates a beginning to absolutely everything. That's a misinterpretation of the physics. So the Big Bang doesn't indicate that all natural stuff had a beginning. It just indicates that the known kinds of natural stuff had a beginning. And so it doesn't indicate a being at all or anything outside of the natural stuff or some new kind of supernatural entity. It's because anything that the supernatural could potentially explain can also be explained by just unknown natural forces.
Okay, that's interesting. So, I mean, I've heard, other models for, other cosmological models that they have, but I wasn't familiar with the idea of that there could be some other kind of space and time pre-existing our space and time. That's different. So, but I don't know, does that not just kind of push the question back a level, because you still want to know, does it go on for infinite number of space and times? Just one before the other, or is there a stopping point, like where, well, no, there was one first space and time, or I don't know, what do you do with that?
Oh yeah, you're absolutely right. So science doesn't give us any ultimate answers. Those are those omni properties I was talking about earlier. So science is knowledge is a progression, like adding from, we start with 0 knowledge and we add 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, but we can never say we've reached the biggest number. There's not even a possible justification. Nothing in science can say we've reached the biggest number, we're done. It's not even an option, which is where science differs from theology, because theology is claiming here is the biggest number and its name is Yahweh. And science says, nope, there's nothing that can really justify that, so we don't make any of those kinds of claims. But science could. Science could at any time just say, this is the biggest number, general relativity is all there is, we're done, science is over, we can all go home now. But we've learned from science that it's just unjustified to ever make those kinds of claims. So you're right that science leaves open the possibility that there could be an infinite regression, there could always be something more, and we don't know how to get to a stopping point. It's just outside of human knowledge to make such kinds of claims.
So would you say, on the claim that there have been an infinite regress of space-time things, would you say you're undecided on that?
Yes, I would say I'm undecided on that. I would lean a different route. So, for example, I like the contingency argument. It's my favorite argument of the theist, that there has to be some kind of necessary something, but that necessary something could be a natural necessary something rather than a supernatural necessary something. But it could also be an infinite series or an infinite set of regression of some kind. I've seen some people argue that there's some contradictions with those, but those contradictions are only apparent. They're solvable. There's no actual contradiction between an existing actual infinite.
Okay, you said a lot. But are you undecided on that particular question?
Oh yeah, absolutely. It could be a necessary natural thing. It could be an infinite regress natural thing. It could be a God. I have no idea. I just know There's no reason to believe one over the other.
Okay. So, but you're an atheist, right? So you don't think it was God.
Right. I tend to think that, particularly I'm an atheist in regards to the Christian God, because I think there are certain contradictions in the Christian God's properties. But there could be like a deistic God or something. I don't see any contradictions there. But normally when we say God, we're usually referring to like the Abrahamic kind of a God. And so I'm an atheist in regards to that God.
Okay. So what are you in regard to other gods?
I tend to think they're usually just things we made up just from intuition and past history. So I tend to lean towards the naturalistic scientific approach. But again, I don't really take a stance on the fundamental nature of reality. My honest answer is I don't know what the fundamental nature of reality is, and it's not really a question I am prepared to even attempt to answer. But if you're just asking me what is my intuitive position, it's probably naturalism.
Okay. Well, yeah, is it intuitive? Am I asking intuitive? I don't know. So I guess I'm curious as to why you're an atheist rather than just being undecided about God.
Well, I'm an atheist in regards to the Christian God because of the contradictions in God's property. There are things that make the Christian God like a round square, just something that contradicts itself so it can't really exist.
So with regard to theism as a big umbrella, right, that would include all the other kinds of theisms that you've described, you're undecided on whether theism is true?
Right, there could be other kinds of gods out there. I can't refute all kinds of gods. I can only refute certain kinds of gods. So if you want, you can call that agnosticism, but most popular atheists still refer to that as atheism, like Hitchens, Harris Dawkins, Dennett, those kinds of guys.
Well, now I'm just interested in you. So,
Well, I tend
you
to
know,
agree with them. I like that. I like that meaning of the term atheism. The atheism is the positive rejection of any reason to believe in a God, not the positive rejection of the existence of any gods. Kind of like, I don't believe there's any reason to believe in leprechauns. Maybe there are
okay,
leprechauns, but I don't really care. As long as if
okay.
there's no reason, the reason is what matters to me.
I'll give this one more little push, and then we can move on, I guess, because I don't want to get bogged down on this question, even though I like the question. But so if I just take the proposition theism is true, right? Just take that proposition. Or you can make it something like there is some kind of God. Whatever kind of God that is, we don't know, but it's some kind of God. Do you take that claim to be true or false? Or are
Neither.
you undecided?
Undecided.
Undecided. Okay.
So my position is I don't know what the fundamental nature of reality is. I don't know. Intuitively,
Okay.
I guess naturalism, but I don't know.
So what's the difference between undecided and atheist? I mean, why do you use the term atheist?
Because most atheists use the word atheism in that way, in the epistemic way of saying there's no reason to believe. It's not about claiming there is absolutely no God. Even though in the academic sense it's used differently, I like to use the more colloquial sense because it's more what I identify with. It's the group that is who I'm a part of.
Okay, let's maybe do it this way. Give me real quick, your one sentence definition of atheism again.
There is no reason to believe in a God.
There is no reason to believe in God. Couldn't a theist, like a fideist,
Yes.
be that?
Yes, they could.
So you think fideists are atheists?
If they agree with me on that, I'm happy to grant them that label if they want it.
But they wouldn't want that label, of course, right?
They may not.
They would reject that label.
Right.
Wouldn't you need to add something to that to say there's no good reason to believe in God? And by the way, for the audience, a fideist is just someone who believes in God and doesn't think they need any justification for it whatsoever. They just believe it sort of by some weird notion of faith. They just believe it. So they could believe there are no good reasons or arguments, but they believe nonetheless. So, but they would certainly, I think it might be a little unfair to say, well, they're just another kind of atheist. Well, right? Because they clearly believe in God.
Right. So they could be, but I tend to value epistemology more than I value ontology. I don't care about what exists. I care about what reasons we have to believe things. And that's all that matters to me. Like anything about beliefs, about what really, really exists, I think are completely ridiculous. We don't know what exists. The only thing that matters to us, or should matter to us, is what reasons do we have to believe it. So from my worldview, if there are no reasons to believe in a God, that trumps whether or not you believe there is a God. That's just how I prefer to use the language and the terminology.
So then what does it mean to be undecided then? How is that different from, give me your quick gloss on a person, or you can use the term agnostic. I mean, I know there's a lot of debate about what agnostic means, but we'll just call it undecided if that's easier. What does it mean with regard to theism for someone to be undecided?
Like in regards to the epistemology, to not know if there's reasons to believe in a God, or to not, or to know that there could be, or to believe there could be reasons, but they're not compelling reasons.
Well, so if we're talking about belief states here, right? So we're talking about what a person believes is true or false, or in the undecided case, they don't affirm that is true or false. So I just want to see, it just seems like if we're going to carve up the landscape, we just ought to have a nice way of carving it up that doesn't conflate the terms and gives people some epistemic space to be wherever they want to be, right? So if being an atheist means there are no good reasons to believe in a God, what does it mean to be undecided?
I don't know if there are any good reasons to believe in a God.
I don't know if there are any good reasons.
Or like I said, there are some reasons to believe in a God, but they're not good or not sufficient. So either of those would be the agnostic terminology.
Could it be, would this also work? You think there are just as many reasons to believe in God as there are not to believe in God?
Sure, that could work.
So you could have no reasons whatsoever for either view, or you could say, I have an equal amount of reasons for both views.
Sure.
Okay. So or no, actually, what you said was, I don't know if there are any good reasons. So that you could be just simply say, I personally don't have any. They could be out there, but I just haven't come across them. Right. So it's sort of but my personal total evidence doesn't contain any good reasons to believe in God or to deny God's existence.
Right.
Right. Or you could say my total evidence that I have has an equal amount on both sides. So the scale just stays level. Right. It doesn't tip one way or the other. Okay.
Or you could say
there's
some that actually do lean towards theism, but it's not compelling enough, and that would still be agnostic.
Okay. So maybe it could be just a slight tip, but not sufficient.
Right.
To really. Yeah, I think that's fair. So why are you in the atheist? Why would you be on the atheist? Like if we just had a line divided into 3 parts, right? So you have the atheists, undecided, theists. What pushes you over into the atheist view with regard to theism in general, not just Christian theism?
Right. I believe that there are no arguments to indicate the existence of a God of any kind. There's none. I take the positive position that there are no arguments, no evidence for the existence of God, as opposed to naturalism, comparing it to naturalism.
Okay. So, but wouldn't that mean, but couldn't an agnostic say the same thing?
In my view, not as much, because I'm making the positive claim there are no good reasons to believe in God, whereas agnostic would be, I don't know if there are good reasons, or there are good reasons, or there are equivalently good reasons and bad reasons, but my position are no good reasons.
So you're making more of an ontological claim. That means you're talking about what exists, right? Not what I know or what I'm aware of. That is more ontological.
Sort of.
I'm not trying to trick you here. I'm just, to say I don't know is definitely an epistemic claim, right?
Right.
But to say no, they're not out there. I'm telling you, you could search forever for an infinite amount of time, and you'd never find a good reason to believe in God.
Right. Exactly. That's what I'm saying. I'm making the strongest claim I possibly can, and my claim is not like I can't really prove that, but I'm saying I'm making it falsifiable. So if you can present one, then I'll be proven wrong. So it's kind of like science. I'm making a very strong claim that is falsifiable, easily falsifiable.
But so you don't think there are any good reasons to be an atheist?
I think that until I'm provided a reason to believe in a God, then it is reasonable to believe in God.
Oh, I see what you're saying. Okay, so
it's like,
but why not just be a undecided then? So I don't know. I just this is something I've bumped heads with a lot of people over in the last couple of years. So I'll stop belaboring the point, but it's just an interesting idea.
It's just more the definition that the modern colloquial atheists identify with. It's the thing that we attach to, and it makes more sense to us than to use the term agnostic.
That's fair. That's fair. I guess, as a philosopher, I think of we do take into consideration like ordinary language, like how people talk. Sometimes that helps us actually pick out real things in the world or figure out what's really going on. Because the way people talk is, I don't know, it's a fair guide to what's true and what's not. It's one indicator sometimes. So I usually like to, like instead of just going with, well, this is the way people talk as my only guide, I'd say, well, what's coherent, what's consistent, what lines up with what we know about the universe and that sort of thing. So I don't know. I just like to be more precise with the definitions. So something else just popped in my head. I was sitting here because I was trying to write down some of your argument earlier about why there can't be any good evidence for God, and you talked about the omni properties, right, of God's omniscience, omnipotence, etc. And I've heard you talk about this in other interviews, but you thought you couldn't have evidence of those kinds of claims. Am I right so far?
Yeah,
for omni type claims, that you can't really have evidence because you need a special kind of evidence, right?
So I would say that we don't have any evidence that we have right now that could potentially indicate an omni. There could be evidence out there that might be able to, but none that we currently have.
Okay. So it could be out there. So then you wouldn't say there is no good evidence.
Yeah, right. We don't have any right now, so it's an epistemic claim. None
Or
human
wouldn't you
knowledge.
say you don't have any? Wouldn't that be more fair? Like, because you can't actually know what everybody else is thinking.
Right. It's just a burden of proof claim. I'm saying I'm going to make this my standard, and if you can prove me wrong, then I'll accept I'm wrong. But it's falsifiable, highly falsifiable. I'm going to make the
And
claim there is none within any human knowledge. Prove me wrong.
okay, so your claim is no human being has any good reasons to believe in God?
Right.
Okay. I'm just going to write that down if that's okay. No human being ever, right? So not even ones that lived 100 years ago, right?
Right.
No human being ever has, or no human being has ever had a good reason to believe in God. Does that sound close?
Yeah. The way I normally phrase it, I say there's nothing within human knowledge that indicates the existence of a God.
Oh, there's nothing within human knowledge that indicates. That's the same thing, I think.
Right.
They're synonymous. But you think they could? They could, like tomorrow, right? We could wake up and the newspaper headlines be like, a good reason to believe in God. And you could go, oh, hey, there is one, right? So you think possible. That's possible.
I'm pretty much willing to grant almost anything is possible. So.
Okay. Well, I mean, yeah. Okay, that's fine. Yeah. I'm just trying to get clear on what the claim is. It's not, you're not claiming that there can't be any good evidence, right?
Right. Only there can't be given the current level of human knowledge. There's nothing within the current epistemic means of human knowledge that can indicate a God. That's it.
So, so you think how would human knowledge need to change for there to be good evidence for God?
I have no idea. You'd have to be able to justify some kind of omnis. Like if I said I could hold infinitely many napkins, there'd have to be some way to justify the claim I could hold infinitely many napkins. And no finite number of napkins I can hold would ever justify that, because any finite number is still 0% of infinite. So we'd have to have some way to justify that claim that I can hold infinitely many napkins, essentially.
Okay. Can you hear me typing?
Yes, a little bit. It's not bad though. Don't worry about it.
Okay. Okay, so help me understand this other part about, okay, so with the claim about napkins, right? I get that. That makes sense to me, right? To say that Tom can hold infinitely many napkins, there's no inductive argument. There's no inductive method we could use, adding one napkin at a time or even a million napkins or whatever you want, right?
Right.
Except short of infinity, which I don't think we can do. So, so there's no way to justify a claim. It seems a claim like Tom can hold infinitely many napkins. In other words, I shouldn't believe that, right? To put it another way, right? And there's probably nothing you could do short of, well, I don't know, but presumably there's nothing you could do that could change that situation such that I should believe.
Right. There's nothing that could justify that belief.
Okay. All right. So, okay. So I think I'd like to grant that there's not a good inductive argument for omniproperties. That maybe somebody could show me one. I could be wrong about that, but I'm just going to grant that for a minute. What about like using an abductive type of argument, right? Like an inference to the best explanation.
Well, how could the omniproperty ever be the best explanation? Wouldn't it always
No.
to...
That would be the phenomenon, or in other words, so let's get clear on what is being explained. So inductively, there's no good argument for you having the ability to hold infinitely many napkins. But if I use a different sort of approach, and if I said, well, so I'm not going to posit an omniproperty of Tom, right? Just relying on induction. But if we're talking about God, so And I know I've heard you say other places, well, if you had a God that was limited to no omni properties or something like that, you're like, yeah, that's fine. Right? Is that right?
Yeah, absolutely. So there's two parts to my epistemology. That's the major part, is that if you're willing to grant that the omni properties, you have to have like some kind of fideistic belief about those. I'm totally okay with that, as long as you don't say that you can justify that God is uncreated or all powerful or all knowing or all those kinds of things. I'm happy with that. It's the claim that he is those that I don't think can be justified. Just like I can't justify that I can hold infinitely many napkins.
Right, by an inductive argument. So the abductive case would be like an inference to the best explanation, where the reason why you believe, or why a theist would believe that God possessed these omni properties, is to explain certain observations or other things that we take to be true, right? So, for instance, the creation of the universe. So, if we're gonna make some kind of God to be the best explanation for the origin of the universe, then that God is probably going to need, the more we think about it, that God's probably going to need to have certain kinds of properties, right? He can't be 6 inches tall. Well, I mean, maybe he could be 6 inches. Well, he can't be composed of matter. So there's no, I mean, talking about height would be.
Well, I'd object to that too.
Well, if we take, well, okay. So if we take the creation of the universe to mean, like this is the standard way, the creation of all space and time, right? There was no space and time. There was no matter prior to that act of creation. Then God couldn't himself be composed of matter, right? Now, I suppose if you wanted to say, well, there was some matter before our universe existed, is that kind of one possibility you're leaving open?
Right, that would be one possibility, but I'm leaning more towards the argument that if you wanted to claim that literally all possible forms of matter came into existence, that would itself be an omni-property. Like, there could always be more matter out there that we just don't know about. You can't justify the claim that all matter and all space came into existence. It's just not possible, for the same reason it's not possible to demonstrate that I can hold infinitely many napkins.
But you're talking about induction and demonstrating something, and a lot of arguments can't be done that way, and nobody tries to do them that way, right? Like you use other kinds of reasoning, like in murder investigations, right? We don't demonstrate that someone has done something by some inductive process. It's usually we gather evidence and we say, well, which candidate fits this evidence best, right? That's probably the guilty person.
Just to interrupt you for a little bit. So
yeah.
In your argument, you've smuggled in an omni. You're saying that the best explanation is an omnipotent God because there's this omnipotent thing. There's this need for all matter and all time, which is itself an omnipotent kind of a claim, to be explained. And the best explanation for that would be an omni property. I would agree. The problem is that that's not something we observe. We can't observe that in the first place. So you've smuggled in an omni and then explained it with another omni.
What can we not observe?
The creation of literally all space and all matter. That's not a potential explanation. Nothing can justify that kind of a claim. That's kind of just an unsupported assertion. Because physics doesn't say that. Physics just says that our own kind came into existence.
Well, that's interesting. I'm gonna have to defer to you on the physics, because I know there are competing models for the origin of the universe, but I wasn't aware of. And so you're saying there are models that say, well, there was matter, space, and time, and you're not talking about a multiverse, right? Or are you talking about a multiverse?
Well, it's one possibility, but the best one I like is Emergent Space-Time by Nima Arkani Hamad. So he says space and time emerged from more fundamental natural properties that are not made of space and time.
Okay, and can you give me a rundown, or not a rundown, but just like a quick, like what justifies that view?
I'm not that good at quantum physics, but his paper is called The Amplituhedron, if you want to look it up. It's fairly well cited. It's pretty popular. And Sean Carroll is working on the same thing. It has something to do with quantum mechanics. I don't understand it.
Okay, so do you think they're using an abductive form of reasoning?
Maybe, but I'm not objecting to abduction here. That wasn't the point. I'm not. The objection I was making is that you've smuggled in an omni for no reason, and then you're using that omni to explain to.
See, I don't know if it's no reason. So again, like even in physics, there are plurality of views and models. I don't know what the consensus is currently, so I can't really speak to that. But what we can do is say, well, let's consider we have multiple models, and maybe we don't know which one is the accurate, true one at this point. Like I don't think that's strange to say we're not sure which one's correct, because it's awfully difficult to prove. But there are a lot of hypotheses. So given one of those, like we could just pick one, say, well, let's look at this one. I know at least one of those models is a model that says, before the Big Bang, I put that in quotes because there was no time, but that no time or space existed whatsoever. That literally everything that is in the material universe came into existence at that first moment.
As far as I know, none of the physics theories say that. Not a single one.
Really?
Yeah.
Well, I can't, unfortunately, I have no way to argue with you on that. So.
Well, so my impression is that all science is tentative and provisional. It never makes any ontological claims about everything ever. It just doesn't do that.
Well, it makes claims. Surely it makes claims.
Right.
But we say, hey, this is our best. This is the best we've got based on the information we have. This is our best shot, right? And hopefully, scientists aren't too dogmatic about that. They're just like, sure, it might be wrong. And then the equations work really well. We've had lots of confirmation. This seems to be a really good theory, but it could be wrong. It might get overturned in a couple of years or something like that. So I think they do make claims about reality. They do make claims about the nature of space and time and that sort of thing.
Well, I'm making a stronger claim than that. Like I said earlier, that knowledge in science is like accumulation. You start with 0, you go 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Nothing in science ever says, in no scientific field, we've reached the biggest number. That isn't even an option in science. So we can only say we've got to this number, and there could always be ... This is as far as
that's a very different kind of question than the origin of the universe, right? We're not just talking about counting numbers. I mean, that's a pretty simple case, but I don't think it's really analogous to theories about the origin of the universe.
Oh, I think
right?
it is. I think it's just that's the next number we've reached so far, and there could always be a number behind that, and a number behind that, and a number behind that. So the point that I'm making is that science doesn't ever say we've reached the biggest number. It just can't do that. And so when we talk about the origin of the universe, it's only the origin of all the stuff we currently know about. It's not the origin of all stuff. Science.
Okay. I think we're saying the same thing. I think we're actually totally in agreement on this, because it's just these are provisional claims and they're open to falsification and that sort of thing, right?
Right.
But
So
to make a claim, to make a claim is not to say we're done. Let's close up shop. We don't need any more science, But to make a claim, is to say this is how I think things are, right? I mean, the Big Bang model was something that they inferred from the evidence that they had, such as an expanding universe and so forth. So, but it's a claim about reality. But you can make claims and say, but I could be wrong, right? I mean,
right. So
it's kind of assumed in science, I think.
So to clarify a little bit, I would say that there are no physicists that say there was nothing before. There is an absolute philosophical nothing before the Big Bang. None of the models would indicate that. None of the models even presume that.
Wow. I'm just going to have to take your word for that, because I can't. I have nothing to go to on that. That would be really shocking to me. I'm a little skeptical, but I'd be willing to. Maybe I'm not looking at comments. Is there like a comment gallery going on?
Yes.
Maybe there's a physicist out there or something. I don't know. Are you a physics? And is that your line of work, or I don't even know.
No, I'm a YouTuber, but I've had a number of physicists on. I've had a cosmologist, an astrophysicist, a theoretical physicist, a philosopher of physics, and I've asked these questions quite a number of times. And I have a bunch of quotes of physicists saying this, like Sean Carroll's quotes. I love Sean Carroll's quotes. He says something like, when we say the universe is the beginning, or I can't remember it. I have it saved, but I have the quote saved where he essentially says verbatim what I said, essentially. Yeah.
So, and he's not saying, on my view, as Sean Carroll, my particular view and the view of my colleagues maybe that I'm working with, this is our view, that to say the universe began at a certain time is not to say there was no pre-existing space or time. Or is he saying that's the consensus view?
Oh, he's talking about
among all physicists.
Right. He's talking about a misconception that many people have when they talk about physics, is that it gives you these ultimate kinds of answers, and it doesn't. It's just not what science does. Science gives you the tentative answers of just the stuff we know about it doesn't make these ultimate kinds of answers about absolutely everything.
Okay. All right. Well, maybe we can move on to something that we both know something about. I can. Okay. So, what's a question that we should talk about? I'm trying to think now. Where are we in this dialogue?
So just any evidence, any reason, any argument you think believes in the existence of God or indicates the existence of God.
Well, I think that's kind of a, the reason I don't think that's a great place to start is because you're going to reject all of my reasons out of hand, right?
Well, if I know them, if you present me one I've never heard before.
I mean, they're all going to involve positing a certain kind of God. And so since you don't think it's possible to have any evidence, why would I even try to? Because anything I say, you can say, well, you don't have the right kind of evidence for that omni-God.
Well, right? I'm trying to make it compelling. I want to make it, if it doesn't make sense to you, then that doesn't achieve my goal. So I want to make sure that I can show you that what you believe is evidence works equally as well for the alternatives as it does for God.
Oh, I know where we were in the dialectic. Okay, before we got off onto the Big Bang thing. So without getting into the physics, with trying not to get into the physics, I often use physics illustrations, but my understanding is pretty limited. So, so if we're using an abductive approach, and we say, well, what could be responsible for, say, like you said, you like the contingency argument, right? Even though ultimately, obviously, it's not persuasive for you, but that there has to be some necessary being, whether it's a physical being, a physical reality, or something.
Well, just clarify, necessary something, not necessarily a necessary being, a necessary something.
Well, in philosophy, being is a very generic term. It could mean an atom, right? An atom is a being, something that exists. So it doesn't have to be personal or anything like that. So, but so when I think about what is the explanation for the existence of anything at all, right? Why is there something rather than nothing, right? Now, we may not be able to have like a real definitive answer to that question. We can't prove our answers because we're way out there in speculation world. But it is a question people wrestle with nonetheless, right? So, and I think, well, what sort of explanation could account for the existence of the universe and the way the universe is? And so then a person would say, well, let's see, what kind of being could bring a universe into existence, or what would be necessary to bring such a universe into existence? And one explanation is, a personal God with these omni properties, right? So we're not reasoning in some inductive process to give me omni properties. I'm simply saying, among the explanations, one of the explanations, and I think the best explanation, is a certain kind of personal being with these omni properties, right?
Right.
So in other words, through an inference of the best explanation method, I now have a reason to believe in an omni-max God, or whatever you want to call it. Wouldn't that count as a reason to believe it?
Right, because it's an omni. The necessary thing is itself an omni, so the only thing that could explain it is another omni.
So yeah, well, let's take that route for a second. So what's wrong with that?
There's nothing wrong with that. I'm totally happy to grant that. I just think that if we're trying to apply properties to whatever that means, what necessary means, what the omnis means, I think we have no basis to conclude anything about that. It's just essentially arbitrary label that we apply to things. The stuff that has always existed, the stuff that makes the statement there was at some point an absolute nothing false, and that's what they means. And I don't know, I don't have any definitive definition that we could give to what that would mean. It's just essentially arbitrary. It's just a name for whatever the ultimate answer of everything is. Well,
maybe I'm naive here, and I'll just throw out a few things, and you tell me what you think. But because these seem intuitive to me, but it seems like if we're going to talk about, well, what would that cause have to be like if it's responsible for bringing into an existence everything that is? seems like it would have to be really powerful. That seems like an intuitive, something that's powerless or has the power of, say, an earthworm wouldn't be capable of causing a universe to come into existence. That seems kind of intuitive, wouldn't you say?
Sort of. I would agree in general, but I would ask, what is power exactly? And if you can't give a definition to that, well, then it's essentially just an arbitrary label again.
Is it really an arbitrary label? I mean, you really not? I mean, I'm just appealing to this common sense ways of using words,
Right.
Like some things just have more power than other things.
Right. But if you want to try to attribute that word to some kind of existing thing, you have to actually know what it means. Just saying it has something that we're going to label power is, again, it's just totally arbitrary. It could mean anything, and we have no idea.
How do you define power?
I have no idea in the context of what the fundamental nature of reality is. I have no idea. Any definition I apply is purely just my subjective opinion about how it applies to the world we perceive around us.
I mean, doesn't physics have a formula for power?
Mechanics does, like engineering. Energy, it has definitions of energy.
Let me look at let's see. What is the formula for power in physics? There we go. Let's see. P equals W over T. Okay, so power equals work over time, right? So I don't know. Can we use that definition? So if something can do just an infinite amount of work over some small period of time or over a moment in time, whatever length of time you want to set.
Sure, but again, that only applies in our universe to our physics, and anything outside of that doesn't apply.
Well, I'm just talking about our universe. That's all we've got. We can't really work with other universes. I mean, we don't know anything about them. So,
well, if we're talking about something that created the universe and is outside of our universe, different laws apply. Our laws in our universe only apply to the things within our universe. So to try to apply,
how do you know that?
Well, that's the only justified conclusion. We can't apply the things in our universe to things outside of our universe. It's not reasonable.
I'll grant you that. So I don't think God operates by a physics equation anyway. But I mean, we got to have. So why can't we just have a perfectly intuitive sense of what power is, right? I have more power than a 3-year-old. A 3-year-old has more power than an earthworm. A monster, like a giant truck, has more power than I do. A volcano has more power than a giant truck.
Right. I'm happy to grant that for the sake of argument, but just to be technical, I would have issues with what that exactly means.
I'm guessing, I don't know, but our audience might be getting a little like, oh, come on, guys. Stop wrangling over this. So I'll just run through them. We don't have to parse them up one at a time, but so it seems like this thing that is the cause of the universe and everything that is in the physical realm. It's got to be powerful. It seems to me like it would have to be intelligent, right? And we don't have to dispute that right now. We can come back to it, but I don't think that's a far-fetched seeming, just given the order of the universe and the laws of the universe that seem to be incredibly simple and other aspects. So it seems like intelligence would be a feature of that, right?
Not to me, definitely not.
Okay, yeah, we can come back to that, right? So now I think that this creator, this cause, would have to be personal as well, because the cause, well, for one thing, I mean, this is one thing philosophers have argued about for a long time. To get personal beings out of an impersonal universe seems less likely than having personal beings coming out of a personal cause, like a personal creator. Getting persons from non-persons just seems more far-fetched, seems less likely, far more surprising than persons coming from a person, right? Consciousness coming from.
Well, let me pick up on that point a little bit. So that seems like a composition division fallacy. So like I could say the same thing about suns or matter. The thing that created the universe must be made of matter, because if it wasn't made of matter, well, then why would it make a matter-based universe? It seems less likely for the exact same reason. Or I could say, well, the thing that created the universe created oceans, so it must be made of oceans, because if it wasn't, then why would it create a universe with oceans? It seems less likely for the exact same reason. You can make the same argument of any individual property within the universe other than personhood, and just say, well, it must be made of, whatever created the universe must be made of that. So it doesn't really seem to be a very compelling argument. It just seems to be a composition fallacy.
Well, I'm not using the same logic that you're using. I'm not saying whatever created the universe has to be like the universe. And personhood is a pretty unique property if we're talking about consciousness, using those close to being synonymous. But this is a mystery, and the science still has no clue on what accounts for consciousness or what it is. The other kinds of things you're citing are pretty ordinary sorts of things. They're not really analogous to personhood as being a really kind of queer aspect of, not queer in the cool sense, but bizarre, strange thing that would arise, right, out of a natural universe. Whereas you wouldn't be that surprised to find atoms, molecules combining in various ways.
Well, I don't see any difference there. Like I don't see your connection there. It just seems like you've assumed it's special. Like I could pick a special atom like astatine or something. Astatine is less common in the world than humans and life are. So,
but we understand astatine, right? We understand why molecules behave the way they do. We understand why physical things behave the way they do to a very high degree, whereas consciousness is completely baffling. I mean, this is a
Are you making the argument that we don't understand it, therefore it's special?
No, it is special. And part of the reason that we would say it's different than other things is because it's been so opaque to our science so far.
But it seems like you're making the argument that we can't understand it, therefore it's special. Like, couldn't we have said the same thing about lightning 2,000 years ago?
Yeah, well, lightning probably would have been considered a very special thing at that time. But people don't say, well, consciousness is just another thing like everything else. Eventually, we're just going to nail it down. People think it's like literally a completely different kind of thing. It's not even in the same category. But let's not nitpick over each and every little thing. Let me just finish what I'm going to suggest here. Another reason why I think it would have to be a personal being is because one of the weird things, and again, this is offering, it's not saying this is the only explanation. I'm claiming I think this is a better explanation than its rivals, right? Given all these explanandum, I forget which is the explainer, and I use those terms wrong sometimes, but the things to be explained. So it had to be personal because it would have to have a will, right? It would have to be able to make choices, decisions, and not merely be like a clockwork mechanism. Because if the creation of the universe occurred at some point in time, right, which people do have estimates of when the Big Bang took place, if we're just saying Big Bang was the starting point, we do think it took place at some point in time. It's not like some mysterious outside of time event. The question is, if you had all the conditions set, have you heard this before?
Yes.
Do you know what I'm going to say? Okay.
I do.
Well, if you know it, well, I might as well say it for the audience. But if all the conditions were, all the sufficient conditions were there for the Big Bang, why did it take so? Why did it occur when it occurred rather than earlier or later, right? Because it would have to, the cause would have to be something that would just be going on either at all times or no time, right? There's nothing to sort of pre-program the alarm clock to make the Big Bang go off at a certain time. So, but an agent can do that, or an agent who can make decisions, who can make choices, can decide at some point in time, for whatever reason, not that we need to know what it is, that this is the time to create the universe, right? So go ahead. I'll have a say about that.
All right. So my position is that anything a will can do, natural causes can do. So,
well, this isn't about power. This is about why that particular time. Like why wouldn't the cause have been eternally present? Right.
So my position is that in a will, for a will to do something, there's two options. Either it's determined to do it for reasons, or it does it for no reason, in which case it's random. So those are the only two options. There's nothing you can insert there to get it. Either it's done for determined or it's done for no reason and it's random. And all natural things have the same properties. It's either determined or random. So it could be the universe was created by like some kind of random quantum probability wave, which is why it was created at that particular time as opposed to a different time. And so natural things can answer the same problem. And I could go a step further and say, if you want to say that there's some kind of new feature that will applies to get out of this dichotomy of determined or random, I could just say there's an undiscovered natural property that does the same thing without will. because it seems to me you're just positing this new thing we have no idea what it is, and saying, well, it could do something that all the stuff we currently know about can't do. Well, I can just say the same thing. There could be this new natural something that can do something we just don't know about yet.
Well, no, that's how IBE or abductive reasoning works. Is you look at these things that need to be explained, and you come up with a hypothesis that explains all the things better than, say, a rival hypothesis. And it's not. The thing is that some properties. I mean, you're familiar with the idea of ad hoc, something being ad hoc, right? So to say that the universe has the ability to make choices would seem ad hoc, right? Because that does not really fit well with what we know about natural universe properties. But it fits perfectly well with a divine being, right?
Well, that's the argument I'm making there is that is equally as ad hoc as saying the universe can make choices. So
why is saying God can make choices ad hoc?
Because any choice made by any will ever is determined or random. Those are the only two options.
No, that's your personal view. You haven't really argued for that view. You're just asserting. What you're doing is just contradicting me. This is like the Monty Python argument clinic, right? Yes,
right. So I'm arguing it right now. I'm saying, give me a third option. Tell me how you can get out of this dichotomy. Either something is done. Okay. Tell me
a non-physical being that simply is an agent that can make choices.
But this dichotomy applies to non-physical beings, so I don't see how that gets you out. So every single choice is done for reasons.
How could a non-physical being, what is determining their behavior?
Their nature.
Okay. I mean, but when you use determine, you're talking about physics, I'm assuming.
No, not at all.
Okay.
So any reason or any choice done by any will is either going to be done for reasons. It doesn't matter if these are natural reasons, supernatural reasons, physical, non-physical. It's going to be done for reasons, or it's going to be done for no reason. The P or not P. If it's
so why can't God make a choice for a reason?
He can. That just means it's determined. And so it's determined equally as well as the universe is determined.
But see, that's the whole view about how free will, whether there's free will in the universe or not. And that's a whole nother can of worms. You can't just assert there is no free will and expect me to just go, oh, okay, I guess that doesn't work then.
Right. So I'm asserting that you have no basis of free will. And so you're using free will in this argument as completely ad hoc. Just like if I said the universe had this new free will natural property is totally ad hoc.
Well, it would be ad hoc. It's only ad hoc if you're positing, if I said, well, I think a tea kettle is responsible for the beginning of the universe. I mean, nobody has ever thought that tea kettles have free will, right? There's nothing about a tea kettle that would make free will sort of a nice fit for the property of a tea kettle. But for a God, the way people typically conceive of a God, free will choice fits really nicely. It's perfectly at home in that sort of being. Right? You see how it's only ad hoc if it's something completely alien to the entity, but you're just bringing it up to solve a problem, right? I mean, most people would say this is sort of an essential feature of what it means to be a person.
Right, and people could say that the water has I forget what is it, Plato's 5 forms, and that there's this intrinsic property of matter that are these 5 forms. I mean, he can believe that, but that doesn't make it true. And so I'm saying that the free will property you're arguing for is completely incoherent. I can understand.
I haven't even given an argument. How could it be incoherent?
Well, you're saying
you're assuming it's incoherent. I'm sorry.
No. I'm saying that you're saying that this God thing can do something which is not determined and not random to create the universe at some point, as opposed to any other point, and that naturalism can't do this new kind of thing.
But you think a naturalistic universe could do that?
I'm saying it would be equally as ad hoc to assume that God can do this new kind of undefined thing that we have no idea what it is, to say that the universe can do this new kind of undefined thing that we have no idea what it is.
But people have a perfectly good conception of what free will is and choice. Most people take themselves to have it and use it all the time.
Oh, please explain it to me. Get me out of the dichotomy. So everything you choose is either determined for reasons, which means you have no free will, or it's done for no reasons and it's random, in which you have no free will. So no matter what you do, as far as I can tell, nothing gets you free will. So tell me how to get out of that.
Well, you can believe in that people are agents. I mean, for instance, you can believe that people have immaterial souls that are not bound by the laws of physics, right? I mean, there's lots of ways to escape determinism.
I'm not talking about the laws of physics here. I'm saying that anything you do is done for reasons. Those could be physical reasons or non-physical reasons, supernatural, natural, soul, non-soul. Applies to everything, just deductively. There could be reasons you do action X, or there is no reasons you do action X, and those are the only two options. Now, this applies to everything.
But reasons don't determine. I mean, this is really what we're down here to is a difference in intuition, and this is why this is one of the intractable problems in philosophy, the argument about free will, what it is, whether people have it. I mean, lots of philosophers believe in free will. Lots of theologians believe in free will. Lots of people from all different kinds of walks of life believe in free will. So I'm not positing something bizarre and odd here. This is a fairly typical concept that lots of people have. So,
well, if I remember correctly from the Phil Surveys paper, most philosophers reject free will because it's kind of incoherent.
It might be most, I don't know, but it's certainly not all philosophers.
Well, sure. I mean, there are some philosophers who believe in solipsism, but my point is that as far as I can tell, you can give no coherent definition of free will. It's just kind of, this is what I intuitively believe. And that's not really a good argument, because I can just say the same thing about the universe. I just intuitively believe it's a property of the universe.
Okay. Well, let's just say at this point, I could offer some readings, recommend some readings to you. I mean, this is not a closed case in philosophy. This is a very open case still. So, and just like I'll take your word on physics, maybe you'll take my word on philosophy. But by the way, what time are we going until?
Well, I'm happy to go until you don't have to do it anymore, because I really enjoy the conversation.
No, this is great. For some reason, I thought we were doing an hour, and so I thought, oh no, our time's up.
Oh yeah, I usually set an hour just as a baseline in case people have to go or whatever. But I usually go over if I can. I went 2.5 hours with Dr. Luke Barnes. That was a really interesting conversation.
2.5 hours. Well, okay. So where we are in the dialectic, let me see if I can sum it up. I'm claiming that a certain kind of being that has certain kind of properties is the best explanation for the origin of the universe, for instance. And perhaps not only for the origin of the universe, but for the apparent design of the universe. And this being would have to have certain properties in order to be responsible for the origin of the universe and the apparent design of the universe. And I'm proposing this as a hypothesis. So, and the reason, if I remember, the reason why we got onto this particular topic was you felt like there could not be any good reasons to believe in omni-properties of a God because they require a special kind of evidence. I keep forgetting what that evidence is.
I don't know what it is, though. We just need some new kind of evidence to indicate that.
And to remind me why that is. This part I haven't been clear on. So
it's like the infinitely many napkins. What could possibly indicate that I can hold infinitely many napkins?
Okay, so for a claim like Tom can hold infinitely many napkins, there's no inductive way to go about that, right?
Well, right, I'd go further than that. And so it's not just there's no inductive way, but you can also go with like Gödel's incompleteness theorem and show there's no mathematical way that you could do that, or Tarski's indefinability theorem and show there's no logical way to demonstrate that, or problem of criterion and show, well, if you're going to define something with this property of an omni, well, how did you do that? Did you just pick it arbitrarily, or is there some methodology we use to get there? So as far as I know, there isn't any way in human knowledge that can justify those kinds of things. But I'm willing to grant the contingency argument just off of intuition.
Okay, so now I'm presenting an inference to the best explanation style argument for this omni-God. And I'm saying this God would have to have these kinds of properties in order to explain the phenomena. And your rejection, or what you're saying is no, that doesn't work. That's not a good reason to believe in a omni-God. Why?
Because you can say it about anything. You can say, the universe has these omni-properties. The spaghetti monster has these omni-properties. Deism has these omni-properties.
All right. Well, and then I brought up the whole idea about ad hoc, and you're not willing to agree with me, or you don't agree with me that positing certain properties of certain entities can be ad hoc. So for instance, if I said, this microphone, hey, I just wanted to let you know this microphone is actually conscious, which is why it can take what I say and put it in the computers, because it understands me, I think if I was trying to explain, let's say I really didn't know how microphones worked at all, and I was trying to explain how the microphone worked by positing consciousness to my microphone, that would be, it seems to me, that would be quite ad hoc. And the reason why it would be ad hoc is because there's nothing about the microphone that makes consciousness sort of a logical part of its composition. There's nothing, in fact, it's quite the opposite, right? We wouldn't expect a machine to have consciousness. So positing consciousness to my microphone to explain certain phenomena seems ad hoc, because I'm just throwing it in there arbitrarily just so my boat doesn't sink, right? So whereas positing consciousness to a God doesn't seem ad hoc to me at all, because the way the traditional concept of God works is that God is a person. God is a conscious being who has personal qualities. And as far as I know, I mean, most people who argue for a coherent concept of God, they're going to say this is not only is it part of who God is, but it would be an essential part of who God is. So like it necessarily is that way. And you're saying, but no, I could just easily posit consciousness of the universe.
Oh, well, let me pick up on that. So I would say we could do the same thing with the microphone and say, well, for the past 3,000 years, people have seen this microphone, and it's just an intrinsic part of the microphone that is consciousness. It's just, that's a part. It can't not be the case that this microphone is conscious. It's exactly what explains it. It perfectly fits normally. You could say everything verbatim what you said about God being necessarily conscious, or God having these properties because we've typically believe him to have that property. We could say that about the microphone too, but from my perspective, it's ad hoc because it doesn't explain anything. It has no explanatory power. It doesn't give us any explanation.
But that's not what measures whether something is ad hoc, right? Tell me, like, what do you think it means for something to be ad hoc?
I'd have to think about that to go into it. I just use the term intuitively. But so from my perspective, let me put it to you this way. I would grant, for the sake of argument, that the origin of everything, the necessary thing, has to be all-powerful and or eternal in some sense. But that's it. Once you got those two, you can explain everything else, and nothing else. Any other addition is going to be ad hoc. Okay,
so why would infinite knowledge or infinite omniscience, why would that not work? Why can't I appeal to that?
It just explains nothing. It gains nothing. It adds nothing to the theory. It adds no explanatory scope, explanatory power. It makes it less simple. It does nothing. It accomplishes nothing.
Well, I mean, it would be a great explanation for the apparent design of the universe.
Well, I would reject that completely, because I would say that the apparent design of the universe is apparent, as in it's an illusion. So
that's one way to explain it, that it has that it's just random, right? Or are you saying it has, so you don't, are you saying you don't agree that the universe has apparent design?
It has apparent design.
Okay, it does have apparent design.
It appears to be designed. Apparently,
okay, so
appears to be designed.
So then you think, well, what are some possible explanations for the apparent design of the universe? One possible explanation is a creator with a lot of intelligence, like we'll start there, right? Say really intelligent, like knows more about physics than any person on earth has ever lived. I mean, that, right? This is, if you're going to use a mind as an explanation for the apparent design of the universe, what you're essentially saying is it's a really, really, really smart mind that could design a universe the way it is.
Smart compared to us, but not necessarily smart compared to all possible minds.
Well, then I'll just take the next step and just say it's the greatest possible mind. It's just a perfect mind.
Right, and I'd say that's totally ad hoc. Like,
why?
Like,
why is that ad hoc?
Well, I'd say one, it's kind of like the napkin thing. Like, why? What possible reason would you lead that conclusion? Like, there's nothing that leads to that conclusion. You don't even need a mind.
Let's suppose. Let me just mess with this for a second, because I think, as I've kind of wrestled with your view about omni properties or omni assertions requiring certain kind of evidence, there's some intuitive appeal to that. So I want to just kind of untangle that a little bit. So, or tease that out a little bit. So let's suppose we could measure intelligence on some kind of scale, right? And a person can have 10 units of intello units. I don't know, whatever, intellons, right? And a really smart person's got like 50 and has 50 intellons or something. Einstein had like 90 intellons or something, right? So some measurement of intelligence. So how many intellons would a being who created this universe, how many intellons would they need?
Just the amount required to create the universe, which is going to be a finite number.
Right, but we have no idea how many that would be, right? I mean,
right.
It would seem kind of arbitrary to set a number like, well, I don't know, 500 or a million or 10 million?
Well, you wouldn't need infinite.
Oh, well, I'm just saying at this point, setting a number would be a little weird, right?
Right, but it wouldn't be infinite. Setting it to infinite would be equally as weird as setting a finite number. So like if I said, what is the simplest explanation of the universe? It would be a quantum particle that has exactly the energy required to create the universe. I don't know what that energy is, but saying it's a quantum particle that can create infinitely many universes, well, that would be really weird. That would be even more weird than saying there's one that can create exactly this universe and only this universe.
Well, it's weird to talk about quantum particles creating anything, actually, but for the very reasons I stated earlier. But I understand what you're saying. So I guess the thing I'm worried about is if you try to give some finite account for how much power God has or how much intelligence God has or something like that, you end up with actually a much less simple explanation, a less parsimonious explanation than if you just posit a perfect being with all the great making properties that a perfect being would have, right? So infinite intelligence.
How so? I don't follow your reasoning.
Maybe it's an intuition, but I mean, yeah, this is a tough one. It just seems to me it's much simpler to posit a perfect being that would have all the great making features. In other words, a perfect level of intelligence would have to be infinite, because otherwise you could always have someone with more intelligence, right? This is just a way to kind of bring any potential infinite regresses to a close and just say it's the being with the greatest possible amount of intelligence, right?
Right. But two things there is, why would we go to the being of the greatest possible intelligence based off a finite number of stuff that we see in our universe? That would be like the napkin problem. And then
second, you're going back to induction. I'm sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt you.
That's okay. So, and the second one would be, why, like, if I think of the simplest possible explanation, I would go back to that saying there is a quantum particle that has exactly as much energy to create exactly our universe, exactly as it is. That is the simplest explanation. If I add anything else on top of that, it makes it more complicated. So if I say there's a being who has the power to create infinitely many universes, but chose to make ours, that is significantly less simple than just saying there is a quantum particle that created exactly our universe exactly as it is. So how is this applying these omni properties, which seem to make it the least possibly simple thing ever, make it more simple? That seems to be the exact opposite of simplicity.
Yeah, well, I grant, I hear what you're saying, and I think there's some intuitive weight to that. I guess when I think about what properties this being would have, I don't know. I'll grant. I'll say that it doesn't seem clear to me how an infinite amount of intelligence is simpler than some arbitrary finite amount of intelligence. But the other consideration I think that pushes me that direction is when you posit this being, of course, what you want is you don't want a sort of a random assortment of properties thrown into a bag and shaken around, things that don't connect, that aren't sort of consistent with one another, that don't have sort of a unifying principle of some kind. It seems like the kind of being that we're looking for, if it's going to be a perfect being or the greatest possible being or something like that, that it's it's going to have properties that are consistent with one another, that are unified. Seems like that would be better than a being with a random assortment of properties that don't seem to have any connection or consistency. So if we're going to grant omnipotence, it just seems like a simpler being, a better package to say, well, that being is going to have any kind of property that can be graded, right? That can be sort of, you can have a varying amount in, like power. It just seems simpler and easier to say, well, it just has all power, right? Rather than some finite amount. And so I'm granting what you said earlier, right? That taken that single property, taken by itself, I just, like, I don't have a good reason right now to say why I think that's simpler than some finite amount. But when I think about a being and the total package of attributes that I'm kind of pushing for here, it would be a more perfect being if the attributes all sort of cohered in a certain way and had a unifying, and were unified rather than sort of a random assortment. So I just think a being of that kind makes a better explanation than sort of a Franken being of assorted, arbitrary, finite levels of knowledge or power. Or, I mean, omnipresence is not. I don't know if you don't think the being could be omnipresent either. I suppose you wouldn't go for that.
Could be. I have no idea. I mean,
okay.
If there's a finite amount of like space and time, then it could definitely be present in all possible points of space and time. But I don't know, would that qualify as omnipresent? I have no idea.
Yeah, sure. That would be by most definitions. I think that would work. So
my interpretation would be, I see most of the things that the theist applies to properties of God to be equally as Frankenstein-y as the other properties of the just limited things. So, for example, the spaghetti monster saying that it's metaphysical, magical, non-physical spaghetti. I think consciousness is equivalently as Frankenstein-y to add into these things as spaghetti.
Well, I think that could be our point of contention here, that what makes something ad hoc versus something that seems coherent with a whole. And I, when I asked you to tell me what you think ad hoc means, and you weren't really sure how to say what ad hoc means, that seems important, right? Doesn't it? To be able to say, well, this is ad hoc. Well, what does ad hoc mean? I'm not really sure.
Well, I'd say it's a less good explanation. So we don't need to use the word ad hoc necessarily. So, for example, if we take theism, or the classical theist Christian God, take all those properties, and then we compare it to deism, which is get rid of the personal, that seems simpler. That seems like it would be a better explanation than theism. And if we take
so now we're talking about virtues of an explanation, right? So what makes an explanation good or not?
Right.
I mean, most scientists, because this is exactly the same way you go about it in science, right? So what makes a good explanation in science? And the virtues are going to be the same. Ad hoc is, you want something that's not ad hoc. That's considered a vice of an explanation. So just like simplicity is usually considered a virtue of an explanation. So I would grant, I guess deism simpler. I suppose it might be. I don't know. But of course, it's only one virtue among many virtues.
Right. I'd go a little bit further than that. So just like deism is simpler than theism, I can take deism, remove the consciousness, get pantheism, and now I have something even simpler than deism.
I'm losing you on the feed here. I don't know if it's
can you hear me?
Can
you hear me all right? Can you hear me?
I can hear you. You're frozen on the. There it is. Okay, we're back. I don't know if that's on my end or not.
Okay.
Was I freezing up at all?
I don't know, because I was talking, so I wasn't sure. So, you can hear me all right now?
Yeah. Can you repeat what you said for me?
Right. So if we take deism is simpler than theism.
I lost that.
What?
Okay. Yeah. I'm sorry. It goes in and out, but go ahead. Keep going.
All right. So
deism simpler than theism.
And then if I take away consciousness and have just naturalistic pantheism, that's simpler than deism.
Okay. Maybe. I'll grant that for argument. So keep going.
Right. No. And so then I would say that all of the arguments you present, like the origin of the universe, the cosmological argument, the design of the universe, the teleological argument, those ones you presented can be explained equally as well under naturalistic pantheism as they can under deism or theism. So,
but I've, yeah. So I mean, I don't think that's true at all. But I mean, again, that's where we disagree. Whether, you know, personhood is required, or consciousness, or free will, or that sort of thing. We've disputed on all of those particular properties, and or even a good God, you know, an omnibenevolent, you know, greatest amount of goodness or something like that. Presumably, deism doesn't need that. I don't think. I don't know a ton about deism.
Right. So my point was that if it was the case that all three could explain all the arguments equally, then that would mean the addition of consciousness and the addition of personhood, would those qualify as ad hoc?
Right. Well, but ad hoc doesn't mean less simple, right? That's not what ad hoc means. So, I mean,
so my interpretation of ad hoc is it's just an addition to a theory in order to explain away a contradiction or something like that.
Yeah, that's close. So, I mean, my Latin's not great, but it's translated to the thing, right? It's like an ad hoc committee in a place like the Senate is created for a very specific purpose. It has no other function other than this one particular issue to solve. And then when it's finished, it's disbanded, right? It's not a standing committee. So ad hoc things, it's like you run into a snag with your theory. Somebody says, hey, what about this data point over here? How are you going to explain that? And you're like, oh, well, it also does that, right? And if you say of a God, well, God is also purple. That's why, you know, that's why things are the way they are. God's purple. That's ad hoc, not because it decreases the simplicity, but because your addition of purpleness has no coherence with the sort of the nature of the thing you were working with to begin with. Like it wouldn't have been something that would naturally arise from the essence of that being. Like there's nothing about sort of the core of the traditional concept of God that would include purpleness or demand purpleness. It seems really arbitrary. So, but it just solves this one little snag that I ran into. That's what makes it ad hoc. So it's not about simplicity. Ad hoc is more about consistency or coherence. So to say that God is a person on the traditional concept of God that's kind of been, you know, around for quite a while, that's perfectly consistent with the nature of God. God is, you know, by most people, God is conceived of as a personal being.
Right. So, but you can add those properties in before knowing the problem. If you just make your theory so complicated that it can explain anything, well, then it's already ad hoc because it can explain anything. So even if you come into a problem or a snag, it's never going to be a problem or a snag because you've already included this ad hoc ability to explain anything intrinsically in the theory. That would still be ad hoc, right? If you just made your theory so complicated it can explain any snag away.
Well, I'm not as fast as you here, Tom. So usually ad hoc is something that's talked about with regard to one property at a time. You can't really say of an entire collection that it's ad hoc or something like that. You would say you already had this, but you already had a being with properties A through B or something A through H, let's say, and then you run into a snag and you go, oh well, there's also this one I forgot to tell you about. It's I, and it's that God really loves strawberries. That's why there's so many strawberries in the earth or something like that. What makes it ad hoc is it doesn't naturally connect with what you had before. It seems arbitrary. So
I would include ad hoc. Like suppose we have general relativity, and Einstein added in like potato chip. He said also potato chip. So he's got all relativity and potato chip. Like there's no reason. It doesn't explain anything. It doesn't address a problem, but it's still ad hoc, correct?
That the universe is made of potato chips or something
like
that?
It's just like a funny symbol in the theory that really doesn't do anything. It's just adding in other stuff that really doesn't have any value. It's just there in the theory.
Right. But the qualities that are proposed in the God hypothesis, such as free will or personhood, are there to explain very important things, such as why did the universe hasn't eternally existed? If the cause is eternal and eternally sufficient, then the effect should be eternal as well. But if you have the creation at a point in time, the best way to explain that is a being that's not determined in their actions, but is free, namely a personal God with free will. So it's doing an incredible amount of explanatory work there. It would only be ad hoc if it somehow just didn't fit into the nature of God, right? But that's very at home, it seems to me. It fits very nicely in the overall sort of the traditional Judeo-Christian concept of God.
Right. So I would see it as, so we have a problem. We don't understand how the universe was created at finite time. And then you insert this new thing, which seems ad hoc to me, that we don't need. It doesn't explain anything, and it's no better an explanation than any of the others. It just seems like an ad hoc explanation. But I mean, if we can get caught up on the word ad hoc, isn't really necessary.
I think we are. I think we're caught up on it. I think maybe we should move on to something else.
Right. So from my perspective, the naturalistic explanations would be better. Anything that can be done with the supernatural ones can be done with unknown natural ones.
Can be. I'll grant you that. But I think some things are more at home in a theistic universe than in a non-theistic universe. You know, I mean, and I'll let you have the last word on that one. Then we can, if we want to move to something else, we can do that.
Oh yeah, sure. Go ahead. Do you have another argument you were interested in talking about?
Oh gosh, no. Let's see. I don't know. So I guess maybe let's just backtrack a little bit to why we need a special kind of evidence for omni claims. So I was thinking about this, and tell me if this is also connected to that view. Can I talk about infinite sets or infinite things in mathematics? And
yeah, those would be separate. So it'd be more like existing infinite kinds of things, like things that actually relate to things in reality.
Well, isn't that a little question begging? Like, well, God doesn't count because he's not existent. Wait a minute, that's the very question we're disputing, right?
What?
Is whether God exists. So, I mean, I think God does exist. So,
well, I'm saying there isn't a problem with talking about infinites if we're just talking about abstract ideas. So if you're just saying that God is an abstract idea in your head and you want to say he's all powerful, I'm like, okay, I can grant that.
Okay. So you would take a sort of a nominalist view of numbers. You don't think numbers exist?
Yes, I do not think numbers actually exist.
Oh, okay. That's fair. So, so infinity is a sort of a useful fiction that we use to construct models and that sort of thing.
Right. It's a descriptive property of a set. It's like,
okay, I suppose that's fair. I'm not super deep on that subject, so I won't try to swim any further. But I mean, if you had a different view of numbers, I think numbers exist. I don't know. I have a good friend who doesn't think they exist, but I haven't really let him talk me into it yet. So,
well, what do you mean by numbers exist?
Oh, well,
like platonic?
You could think of them as platonic entities, or just abstract objects, right? If you think that there are such things as abstract objects that exist, they're not made of matter, right? They're just abstract, non-physical entities. So, and a lot of people think numbers or,
logic.
Yeah, I mean, laws of logic, maybe laws of nature, things like that, mathematical laws. But I don't know. That's an interesting. I was just wondering what you thought about those. Can we have knowledge of those kinds of things? Like, can we talk about, there's an infinite number of points between A and B on a line. Most people think, there would be. It would be true to say there's an infinite number of points between any 2 points on a line. And that doesn't seem to require any special weird evidence, right? It just seems like something most people take themselves to know.
Right.
But I guess sorry, go ahead.
That'd be definitional for me. It'd just be like, there are infinitely many ways we can describe talking about this. So my perspective on math and logic is that reality exists and reality is whatever the way reality is. And we use math and logic as languages to describe reality, but they aren't a part of reality. They don't exist. They don't govern reality. They're just our way of describing it. That's fine. So I guess you'd be an anti-realist with regard to science. I don't know if you're familiar with that debate. Not exactly. So anti-realism, the statement that science describes reality as it is, as opposed to just phenomenology or instrumentalism. I don't really take a stance on ontology. It's not really important to me. All I care about is what we have reason to believe. But I'm happy to grant scientific realism for the sake of argument. I'd lean that direction intuitively.
Okay, an intuition is fair. Why do you think numbers don't exist, though?
Because numbers are like language. It's like English. I wouldn't say English words exist. I'd just say they're things that we use to describe things that exist.
But that's not a reason to think they don't exist. You're just telling me what they are.
Right.
They're just, it's like language, and English doesn't exist. So
yeah, it's what they are is things in our head and our imagination that we use to define things. They aren't existing things. They're imaginary things.
but why do you prefer that view over the view of, say, a Platonic realism or something like that?
Because as far as I know, we have no reason to believe they are anything but imaginary things because we can't discover a number hiding behind a rock somewhere. They're exactly the same as language, as far as I can tell.
But I mean, I think this is kind of interesting. Maybe we shouldn't go too far in this because I might lose some people. But
my viewers love this kind of stuff. We talk
really,
about, yeah.
Okay. Well, yeah. I mean, there are good reasons to think numbers exist as abstract objects. This is a debate among philosophers. You know, it's not a terribly interesting one, but it's so there are definitely. I mean, people are still writing journal articles about this subject and arguing for the existence of Platonic entities and so forth. So it's not a closed question at all. But they're certainly not physical things, right? So the fact that we can't find numbers hiding behind a rock shouldn't really count against their existence, right? I can't see quarks either, you know, but I don't count that against their existence because I shouldn't be able to see quarks.
Well, I'd say we can indirectly observe quarks, whereas I don't think we can indirectly observe numbers.
No, I don't know. We observe numbers through mathematics, you know, their properties and the equations that we discover and so forth. These are, but I don't know a ton about that subject, so that's about as deep as I can go on that one too. So
all right,
stop there. But I was just curious, yeah, how you treated those things like that. Yeah, there were some other infinite things I was thinking about. I wondered what your views are. So much for the screen sharing. I thought maybe that would be helpful, but it never really came around.
Well, we haven't talked about the problem of suffering at all yet, because that's essentially the biggest.
Oh God, that discussion would make me suffer. So I don't know if I want to talk about it. No, that's a good one. That's the hardest question for me. That's for sure the most difficult debate. I don't know if I have anything really new to say on that one. I imagine you seem pretty well read, so I imagine you've read most of the arguments for and against that particular.
Right. Well, I actually have new arguments I've come up with regarding that.
So, great. Well, go ahead, share one if you want to share one.
So the classical Plantinga's free will defense, or more generally there could be some sufficient reason defense, is saying that the reason God allows suffering is because there's some sufficient reason, like free will, that is a greater good than the allowing of the suffering. And I object to that, and I say there can't be a greater good, because no matter what that greater good is, it can always be made better by making it optional. So if you say there is suffering and the suffering allows for some development or whatever, I can say, if you made that suffering optional and every human being got to choose whether they were going to live in this world of suffering or not, that world would have this suffering and the benefits, but it would be even better than just having the suffering and the benefit. And so no matter what you add in for a sufficient reason, that sufficient reason can always be made better by making it optional. So there can't actually be a sufficient reason to justify suffering because it could always be made better.
Wait, I lost a part of that. So maybe this is a good time to write something down and put it on the screen. So let me see if I can give it to me again, and let me see if I can write it down. So
for any sufficient reason to allow suffering, it can be made better if you make it optional. So you have to make the prerequisite and the suffering optional. That'll make the universe even better than with the suffering and whatever the benefit is if it's not optional. So any possible reason that could be allowed to justify suffering can be made better by making it optional. And the
making what optional?
The suffering and whatever the benefit is. So for example, God could say, I created this universe in such a way where you experience suffering, but you'll also experience this kind of spiritual growth or whatever. And he forces everyone into it without their consent, like Adam and Eve and all of us. We didn't get an option, as far as I know, to be here. It would have been better if God would have made a universe like this and he gave everyone the option. He said, before you go, here's what you should know. You can go to this universe with all the suffering and pain, or you can go to a universe without suffering and pain. You can just turn it off, go to your own universe, do whatever you want, but it's up to you. That universe would be morally superior to a universe where we're forced to experience involuntary suffering.
So, and then it would go to the next point would be something like, God should make the best universe that he can.
Right, the best of all possible worlds, to use the Leibniz term.
Well, that one, I don't like to use that term because that brings in a whole new set of problems. But I think intuitively we can at least say, so God at least ought to create the best universe that he can create.
Right.
Right? Okay. And supposedly he can create this universe you've described where you get a choice. Now, I guess it'd be something like, where would the choice come in exactly? Like, how would that work?
So God creates your soul or whatever, and then he gives you like a list of, here's all the properties of this universe, and you sign at the bottom and click agree to the terms, or go to your own universe. And then you can agree, then you go to get born into Earth, all the suffering and pain, or you could just go to your own universe.
Okay, and then, yeah, okay, then you are born or whatever, right?
Right.
Okay. So that's a better universe. The universe where you get a choice is a better universe than this one.
Right, being forced into a world with involuntary suffering is immoral.
Okay, well, wait, let's hold on. We got to do one thing. So, I mean, that's a different way to phrase the argument, right? You could say being forced into a world, how did you say that? Being forced into a world
with involuntary suffering is immoral. So yeah, it's the same argument, just a different way to phrase it.
How about being involuntarily I mean, I think we could economize here. So being involuntarily born, we'll just say born into a world with suffering is
involuntary.
Or, better, we should say it would be immoral to hope the audience is staying with me. I'll share the screen. Well, actually, I can share it right now, I guess, can I? Let's see. Share the screen. Oops, I clicked the wrong button. Thought I clicked the right one. That's the settings button. Oh wait, no, there's the screen share. Sorry, this is really, I'm demonstrating my tech non-savviness. There's the button, okay. Screen share. All right, so now you can see my argument here. Okay, be immoral to put someone, that sounds really non-technical, in a universe with suffering, or we'll say world.
Well, I would say involuntary suffering, because maybe the person wants to experience suffering, and then it wouldn't be immoral to put them in there.
I haven't gotten to the involuntary part. It'd be immoral to put someone in a world without suffering without their consent. Does that sound good?
Yes.
God puts people in a world with suffering without their consent. Darn, got a split page here. So, and you can probably guess what the conclusion is. 3, so God is
immoral.
Well, God has done something immoral, which you could then go and say God is immoral, but it's close enough. I mean, this gets the job done, right? Just that sentence, you've done enough damage right there. You don't really have to go any further. You've already disproven the Christian God, right? So with that argument. So let's look at this. This is interesting. Okay, it would be immoral to put someone in a world with suffering without their consent. I think the argument's valid, at least the way I've phrased it here. So this is interesting. God puts people in a world with suffering without their consent. that seems true.
I mean, it's possible that we all like agreed to this beforehand, but I just
No, that's without really silly options, right? I
Right.
mean, even if we had and then we didn't have any memory of that, that would seem problematic too.
right.
Somehow, I mean, because we'd feel like we didn't consent to it. So from our point of view, it would be non-consensual, right? I
Right.
mean, I've seen sci-fi shows like that before, where you do something, but you're made to forget it, and then you know anyway. So 2 seems true. This is where I wish I had some other heads around from the theistic point of view to help me catch something I'm missing. But what about number 1? It would be immoral to put someone in a world with suffering without their consent. Okay, one seems true to me. So if 1 and 2 are true, then it's a good argument. It's a sound argument, right? Because I think it's valid. So okay, so here's one worry I have about 1 that I think sometimes people overlook, and you won't like this, but I'm going to say it anyway. So it would be the problem I would see with number 1 is it's going to depend who's doing the putting, right?
What do you mean?
So, well, okay, so if I had a choice about putting you into a, you know, some parallel situation, I mean, other than me having the ability to make, to decide whether or not you're born in this world, but I could put you into a situation with a lot of suffering without your consent. We do that with people in jail.
Right.
And we don't think that's immoral. Or maybe you do.
I actually do. I would think that my view on morality is that it's a justified immoral action, kind of like killing a bear or something. The bear's going to attack you, you kill it, it's still immoral to kill it, but it's justified in order to do something else. So it's still an immoral action. If we lived in the best of all possible worlds, or the best universe possible, then it would be completely unjustified to ever do that under any circumstance. So it would be an immoral action.
Okay. So it would be an unjustified action. It would be an immoral action. No, there's no good reason. You can't imagine, or not just you can't imagine a good reason, but you don't think there is any possible good reason.
Right. So if we lived in the best universe possible, where it is physically impossible to force anyone to do anything without their consent, essentially, then there would be no reason to ever put anyone in jail, because they can't do anything to hurt anybody anyway. Unless they wanted to go to jail. We put them in jail because they asked to, but other than that, there would be no justifiable reason to ever put anyone in jail.
Now, how does that connect with the argument? Help me see the connection there.
To force people to do things without their consent. Like if we could create the best of all possible, or the best universe possible, then it would be immoral for us not to. It would be immoral for us to force anyone into like jail, a world with suffering.
Okay. Well, that assumes that God could create a world that has all the things that we want in it, right? So a world with no suffering, but presumably with some other things as well, right? Because there's a world with no suffering that contains no minds. Right?
No, not necessarily. I mean, we can go to heaven without suffering, and we have minds.
No, I didn't mean there are no other worlds. I mean, that's one kind of world with no suffering.
Right. Yeah, you could have a world without suffering with no minds. Yeah.
You could have a world with one mind,
Yep.
And that mind is disembodied and just living in heaven with God or something like that. So there's a lot of options about how you can have a world without suffering, but could you have the kind of world that has all the qualities that we want in it? I mean, would you rather, maybe you'd rather God just made a universe with no minds? Does that seem better to you?
Well, my perspective is you have to give the mind the choice. It should be up to the individual, not the God.
Well, I'm just teasing out, there's a lot of debate about whether God could create a world that has all the qualities we want and no suffering.
Right.
So it's possible. Yeah. So in other words, the claim would be something like, it's possible. I'm going to stop sharing for a minute because I want to see myself on TV. There I am. So it's possible that there is no such world that is feasible for God to create, that has all the things that we want, including no suffering.
Right. And I would say that's incorrect, because it would just be this world plus the option to turn off suffering. That's really all we need. And that is definitely logically possible. We're at the point where we can almost technologically do it. We can essentially make a matrix where we give every person their own planet and universe to do whatever you want with, and you can just turn off suffering, turn it on, whatever you want. So if we're technologically at the point where we can do it, God should probably be able to do it.
I think that's an interesting idea worth exploring, because I mean, there's tons of stuff written on this, obviously, right? So, and about what a world would be like if you could turn off suffering. And a lot of people, as they've kind of teased that out, it's surprising what kind of other things that you lose along with it. But I'll grant this for a moment. I was just trying to make a point earlier that it's not clear to me that God can create a world that has all the things we want, including no suffering, right? That there is no such world. It's possible that he cannot make such a world because of the free will issue, right? So you don't like that. Obviously, you don't like planning his argument.
Well, let's just grant free will and say we can do it. Why can't God do it?
We can do what?
We can create a world without involuntary suffering. Why can't God do it?
How would we do that?
The Matrix. Have you seen the movie The Matrix?
I have, yeah.
Keanu Reeves, we're all in a computer program. Like, we could make a Matrix kind of a thing and give everyone their own universe where they can decide the rules they want to live by, with suffering, without suffering, with Cheetos, without Cheetos, 10 planets, 1 planet. You can do whatever you want with your universe. So we can make this world without involuntary suffering. You can still experience suffering if you want to. It's optional. But so it seems like if God can't do it, but we can, there's a problem with God's omnipotence.
Well, when you use the Matrix example, there must be, let's use a different example, because there was a lot of suffering in the Matrix world, in the movie, right?
It's just
because people thought that was really bad, right? Like being stuck in the Matrix involuntarily was really, really bad. Now, like Cypher, the one guy who wanted to go back in.
Right. So in this system, it's always voluntary. It has to be voluntary. But
it's got to be voluntary. But
it's a computer program. So we have a computer program that gives everybody their own universe. They can do whatever they want with it.
Yeah. And you think, yeah, that's, I mean, I know there are arguments that can at least show that it's possible that such a world doesn't exist. That God can't, it's infeasible for God to make a world with no evil. I mean, we're just kind of equating evil and suffering, because generally people think certain kinds of suffering are evil, not all kinds of suffering, right? So running a marathon includes a lot of suffering, but that's not.
Well, I wouldn't conflate the two, because my position, I wouldn't say that there's no evil. He can still create evil. Evil can exist all you want. Like, people can still have lust over others, or evil desires or whatever. I see no problem with that. I'm only concerned with the involuntary forcing of other people. So you can still have evil, just not involuntary suffering.
Okay. All right. So back to your argument. So, yeah. So the one question I have about one is, and I think a lot of atheistic arguments trade on this idea, the analogy between human beings and God, and saying, well, if it were me, right, I wouldn't do that. Or if that were me, that would be really wrong. Or if I did that, people would say, you monster, right? But God is not like us, right? So if you're granting the hypothetical concept of sort of the Judeo-Christian God, in the best sense of the word, right? And I could let you put that together however you wanted to, as long as we could both agree on it. But if you have that God, then you don't have just like a big human, or just a slightly improved human, or a real, like Thor or something. You've got something altogether different, something that is responsible for the creation of the universe, something that, in the Christian point of view, essentially holds everything together by his will, right? That apart from him, everything would just fly apart, in some sense. You owe your existence a being who is perfect in every way, and so it's completely good and holy, and all the great making features, and just the sense in which God has a special position as creator that gives him special rights that we don't have. So in other words, God could be justified in doing some things that would be unjustified for me, right? Does that, I mean, are you with me so far? Or do you want to
Right.
push
I would
back on
object
that?
to this. So my objection would be it's always immoral for any being of any kind, no matter what, to force another being into a universe with suffering without their consent. No matter what. Doesn't matter what kind of being it is, doesn't matter what created the universe. At any point, if one being forces another being into a universe with suffering without their consent, that is objectively immoral.
Okay. So so you don't like the idea, or you disagree with the idea that God would have special rights over his creation that human beings don't have?
Right, I just call that slavery.
Tell me the analogy. Just help me parse that out a little bit. So why is it analogous to slavery?
One person is
Like,
being forced.
give me the points of comparison.
So one person is being forced to do things without their consent, to live in a confined space without their consent, to be forced to work without their consent. I could go.
Well, wait a minute. Wait, slow down. So I'm with you on God is putting people into a universe without their consent. I think that's true. That's happening, and it's a world with suffering, right?
Right.
I'm trying to get at the immoral part, like what's driving the immoral intuition, right? Which I see the pull of it, but I want to try to cash it out. So God's not forcing people to work without their consent.
Well,
right?
I'm including the nature of the world itself and the way it works and the fact that we have to work to generate food and survive and to try and avoid suffering. I'm including all of that as kind of a work. But
lots of people choose not to do that, right? So I just want to make the points of comparison really clear that there is actually an analogy.
But if they choose not to do it, they suffer a punishment. Just like if a slave chooses not to do the work, they're going to experience a punishment, which is the suffering.
So if a person in America decides not to work, what's the punishment that God is giving them?
Homelessness, hunger, diabetes, disease, loneliness, all kinds of things.
So you think God is directly causing them to, like, that person decides not to work and therefore God unleashes sort of these plagues on them?
God created the world in such a way that if we don't do these things, whether we consent to them or not, then we're going to suffer these punishments, whether we consent to them or not.
Do you think that system, the way that works, is wrong?
Yes.
In other words, that there are consequences for actions
that we haven't consented to. Yes, that's immoral.
Well, I'm trying to take these things one at a time if I can. I mean, if it were analogous to slavery, if it were a really good, tight analogy, then you'd have a really strong argument. So I'm just trying to figure out if that's the case. And there might be another way to go, a better analogy, right, that you might be able to come up with.
Well, I think it's a pretty perfect analogy. I think in every possible respect, it's exactly analogous. So, for example, if I wanted to be a slave and I chose to go into slavery to experience it and I consented to everything, that would be totally fine. There's nothing immoral with that. But if I was forced
I think that's immoral, actually. But
if I wanted to, if I chose to,
I still think it's immoral. Yeah.
I wouldn't. I would disagree on that point. I think that if it's voluntary and they wanted to experience it, then that's totally fine. Kind of like Christopher Hitchens voluntarily chose to experience being waterboarded. I mean, I don't think it was immoral for the people to waterboard him. I think they were doing exactly what he asked them to do so he could experience it. I don't see them as immoral.
It's not quite the same degree as being enslaved. So, I mean, it's almost incoherent to essentially give your consent to say, I no longer want to have consent.
Right.
Right. So it's almost. Right, anyway, like this is, I know you like Kant. I mean, Kant thought this, right? That suicide and slavery and things like that would be wrong for those reasons.
But the analogy is that if you're forced into a world without your consent, that's immoral. And just like if you're forced into slavery without your consent, that's immoral.
I think you got to add the suffering in there to get it to really work, right? Forced into a world with suffering.
Well, I would go further than that. I'd say if you're forced into any world which you didn't want to be a part of, I'd still consider that kind of immoral. But that's a deeper argument.
Yeah, well, that's an interesting question. Not to get on a rabbit trail, but
we can invert it and say, what if you're forced to live in a world with absolute joy and you didn't want to be there? I'd consider that immoral. Like, if I was forced into heaven, I'm like, Satan or Lucifer is like, just God forces him into heaven. He's sitting there just miserable. Like, no, I hate this. Why did you force me to be here? I'd consider that to be immoral too.
So what if God knows you so well right? He knows all of your desires. He knows everything you want. He even knows about the conflicts within you, right? That like you kind of want this and that, but you know they're kind of inconsistent, and he knows everything about you. He knows exactly the right world for you, the exact one in your mind that you've imagined and dreamed about. And he even has more wisdom than you, so he can make it a little bit better than you even imagined it. And he puts you in that world without your consent, and you're like, this is the greatest existence. It's just every second is actual bliss and happiness and all my favorite things all the time, and I'm happy. What about that kind of scenario?
Yep, that would be immoral because I can make it better. Just make it optional. So God can tell me, he can say, here is your perfect world. Here's what you're going to experience in it. You can go into it if you want to, or you can go to your own universe. And now it's optional. Now it's even more moral.
And let's say, it's interesting because that's exactly the kind of argument that Christians make about not overriding free will for salvation.
Right. I'm using the free will argument here. Granting it exists is the kind of the whole basis of the argument.
Yeah, no, that's interesting. So I think this argument is really interesting.
Thank you.
Maybe what we could do is talk about it next time we meet, because I think we're going to do this again. I'm going to try to host it, which I've never done before. So you'll be my first ever guest.
I'm honored. Thank you.
Yeah, and maybe we could talk about this argument. That'll give me some time to ponder it and explore it a little bit.
Yeah, absolutely.
But it's interesting. I don't think I've heard anything quite like this. So. So I want to think about it. I think it's interesting.
Awesome. So well, yeah, I really enjoyed our conversation. Thanks again for coming on. It was a lot of fun. Yeah.
Well, I appreciate it, Tom. I'm very impressed with what you're doing, and you're very well read. And I don't know much about your background. You didn't share your educational background and everything, but you have an unusual understanding of a lot of these concepts. For not a professional philosopher or whatever you want to say, so I think it's really great. So yeah, look forward to doing this again, and maybe we'll I don't know when we'll do it. It'll be probably a few weeks before we can do it. I'm gonna be, I don't know, I guess we could do it next week. I'll look at my calendar. We can make an announcement on my channel, and maybe you can make an announcement on yours, and
let me know.
Let people know what's going on. All right. Well, best of luck to you, and thanks for the opportunity.
Yeah, thanks for coming on. I'll talk to you later.
All right, bye-bye.
Bye.